There are men in the American West who are present without being seen, not because they hide, not because they are small in any meaningful way, but because they have a particular quality of steadiness that the eye slides past the way it slides past good fence work or a well-built barn. You notice the result. You rarely stop to look at the hand behind it. In Harlan, Nevada, in the autumn of 1887, that man was Joel Crane. He was 32 years old and ran the sawmill on the eastern edge of town, a mill his father had built and his father's lungs had ultimately surrendered to. Joel had kept it running for 7 years since, which was either a testament to his character or a demonstration of his stubbornness, depending on who in Harlan you asked. He was not a large man, but he was solid in the way of men who work with their hands every day without thinking of it as work. Brown hair, a quiet face, eyes the color of creek water in October. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered everything he heard. When old Widow Prescott lost her roof to the August windstorm, Joel had it repaired before anyone thought to organize a collection. He didn't mention it. Nobody had to tell him to. He was, by any reasonable measure, a good man. The problem with good men is that they are sometimes invisible to themselves. Willa Foss arrived in Harlan on a Wednesday in late September in a wagon with her uncle's family, coming from a failed farm in Utah that the drought had finally finished. She was 27 years old, the youngest of 3 sisters, all of them married now except her. She had brown eyes and a composure that people sometimes mistook for coldness until she smiled, and then they understood it wasn't coldness at all. It was just self-possession. She had learned early that a woman who showed everything she felt in a room full of strangers was a woman who gave herself away for nothing. Her uncle Bernard Foss set up a dry goods operation in the building beside the feed store. Willa helped him run it. She was good at the work. She had a memory for what people needed before they asked for it, a manner that put nervous customers at ease, and a talent for inventory that her uncle found quietly astonishing. Within 6 weeks, half of Harlan had an opinion about Willa Foss, and most of the opinions were favorable, and several of them were considerably more than favorable. Joel came in for cedar oil and sandpaper on a Friday in October. He had been in twice before. Brief transactions, nails and rope, and nothing more. He knew Bernard Foss by sight. He knew Willa existed the way he knew most things at the edge of his attention, noted, filed, unexamined. He paid for his cedar oil. He thanked her. He left. Outside, his friend Mac Duvall was leaning against the post, waiting on him, because Mac Duvall had nothing better to do on a Friday morning, and Joel was the closest thing he had to entertainment. Mac watched Joel come out. He looked at the door Joel had just come through. He looked back at Joel. You didn't say a single word to her, did you? I bought sandpaper, Joel said. I mean a word that wasn't commercial. Joel looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has had some version of this conversation with Mac before and expects to have it again. She's working, he said. I wasn't going to stand there. Mac pushed off the post. He said nothing. He had learned that sometimes silence communicated things to Joel that words didn't reach. It didn't communicate anything this time either. But Mac was thinking about something Joel didn't know yet. He was thinking about what Ed Farrow had said at the mill last Thursday, that the older Danner boy, Martin Danner, come up from Carson City with money and prospects and a confidence that came from never having had a reason to doubt himself, had been asking around about the Foss girl, asking the kind of questions that had a direction to them. Willa, for her part, had noticed Joel Crane. She noticed him the first time he came in, and she had thought nothing of it, because she noticed most people who came through the door. It was her job. She noticed him the second time, and she thought that he seemed like someone who did everything he did correctly and without fuss. She noticed him the third time, the Friday of the cedar oil, and she thought, and then she stopped thinking it and went back to the inventory. She was not a woman who allowed herself thoughts that had no practical application. But that evening, sitting at her uncle's table after supper while her aunt did the dishes and Bernard read by the stove, she found herself considering the matter of Harlan, Nevada, and what she actually intended to do with it. She was 27 years old. She had come here by accident. the last working-age member of a family that had scattered to practicality and necessity. She was not unhappy. She was useful. She had built a good small life out of 2 months in a town she hadn't planned on, but there was a difference, she had always known, between a life that was good and a life that was full. She went to sleep without resolving the distinction. In November, the Harlan Ladies' Aid held their annual pie social in the church hall. Willa went because her aunt insisted, and because refusing would have been unkind. She wore the blue dress, the good one, the one her oldest sister had pressed before they left Utah, with the particular efficiency of a woman who believed in being prepared for whatever came next. The social was warm and loud and full of the specific energy of a small town that doesn't have many occasions and therefore treats each one as significant. Martin Danner arrived at 8 o'clock with his hat in his hands and his boots polished and the easy, forward manner of a man who has never had to wonder if he was welcome. He was 35, broad-shouldered, with the kind of looks that photograph well, and an income that preceded him into every room. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had decided on something, and the something was Willa Foss. And he was not accustomed to deciding on something and not acquiring it. He asked her to dance. She accepted, because it would have been rude not to. He was a good dancer. He talked about Carson City with the proprietary affection of a man who wanted her to picture herself in it. He was pleasant. He was attentive. He was watching her with the particular focused attention of a man who is evaluating something he intends to purchase, not unkindly, but with a thoroughness that she felt without being able to precisely name. Across the hall, Joel Crane stood near the refreshment table and watched the dancing the way he watched most things, with the quiet, comfortable attention of a man who is content to be in a room without needing to be at the center of it. He had come because Mac had practically dragged him, and because there was nothing wrong with a pie social, and because he had no particular reason not to. He saw Willa dancing with Martin Danner. He had a vague thought that she looked like she was being patient. Then Mac appeared at his elbow with 2 cups of cider and a question about timber pricing, and Joel turned his attention to the question with the easy, oblivious manner of a man who has no idea what he just failed to see. Across the hall, Willa watched Joel turn away. She looked back at Martin Danner, who was watching her with that careful, complete attention. And she felt, for the first time, something she had kept carefully at arm's length. Not grief, exactly. Not quite. The first faint edge of the possibility that patience had a cost she had not finished calculating. Her aunt found her in early December at the kitchen table, sorting dry goods receipts, and set down a cup of coffee beside her and said without preamble, because Aunt Frances Foss was not a woman who used preamble, "Martin Danner spoke to Bernard last week." Willa continued sorting receipts. About what? He asked how long we were planning to stay in Harlan. He asked whether you had any plans that were, his word, fixed. Willa's hands slowed. Frances. Her aunt's voice was careful. He's going to make an offer, a formal one. Bernard thinks within the month. Willa looked at the receipts. They were very orderly. She had organized them by supplier and then by date, and they were the most orderly thing on the table. And she had been glad of that until this moment. "He's a good man," she said finally. "He is," her aunt agreed. She sat down across from her. "Willa, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You know I'm not that kind of woman." A pause. "But I've watched you for 2 months, and I've watched you in that store, and I've watched who you watch when you think no one's paying attention." Willa looked up. "I'm not telling you anything you don't know," her aunt said simply. "I'm just saying it out loud so it exists somewhere other than inside your head." She got up and went back to the kitchen. Willa sat with the receipts for a long time. It was Mac who told Joel. He did it on a Tuesday morning at the mill, leaning against the same fence post he seemed to favor for significant conversations, with the directness of a man who has decided that subtlety has had its chance and failed. "Martin Danner is making a formal offer for Willa Foss, probably before Christmas." Joel was checking the tension on the main saw blade. He didn't look up immediately. "Where'd you hear that?" "Bernard Foss's nephew, who heard it from Danner's foreman, who has no particular reason to invent things." Mac paused. I'm telling you, because I'm your friend. And because as your friend, I feel I've been patient about this for approximately as long as a man can be patient and still call himself a friend. Joel set down the wrench. He straightened. He looked at Mac with the genuine, complete puzzlement of a man who is not quite sure what he's being accused of. Mac. Joel. Mac looked at him evenly. Willa Foss has been in Harlan for 2 months, and in that time she has had 3 men call on her formally and has shown interest in none of them. 3 men. Now a 4th is arriving with money and a city address and a foreman who gossips. He paused. You come into that store every week. I buy supplies. You buy supplies, Mac agreed pleasantly, and you stand at that counter and you talk to her about lumber costs and whether the road to the Prescott place is passable, and then you leave and she watches you go, Joel. She watches you every single time, and you walk out that door like a man who has no idea he's leaving something behind. The mill was loud around them, the familiar noise of the blade in the wood, the sound of the place Joel had spent most of his adult life. He said, she wouldn't. She has, Mac said simply. She's been waiting for you to give her a reason to, and Martin Danner doesn't know that. And if you keep buying your sandpaper and your cedar oil and your absolutely nothing else, she's going to have to make a different kind of choice. He pushed off the fence post. I've said what I came to say. He left. Joel stood at the mill for a long time afterward. The saw ran and the wood split, and the morning light moved across the floor the way it always did. He held the wrench in his hand and he thought about Martin Danner and a formal offer before Christmas, and about Mac's voice saying she watches you every single time. He set the wrench down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have gone slightly unsteady for a reason that has nothing to do with the work. It happened on a Thursday. Willa was coming back from the post office on Main Street. The afternoon cold and bright, the kind of Nevada December that made everything look cut from tin. She passed the mill. The gate was open. Joel was outside stacking lumber, sleeves down against the cold, breath visible in the air. She stopped, because she always stopped when there was a reason. Afternoon, she said. Afternoon, he said. They talked. The road conditions. Whether Bernard had gotten the stove fixed. The Henderson order that had been delayed. The conversation they always had. Easy and warm and so completely comfortable that it was possible, if you didn't look carefully, to mistake it for something less than what it was. Then Joel set down the board he was holding. He looked at her, not the way he usually looked at her, with the comfortable, unguarded attention of a man in familiar company. The other way. The way that arrived sometimes when he forgot to be casual about it and stayed for just a moment before he blinked it back. He didn't blink it back this time. He said, Willa? Not a question, just her name, said like something he had been holding for a while. She went still. I heard about Danner, he said. He looked at the stacked lumber, then back at her. I don't have any right to say anything about that. I know I don't. I've had no right for a while now, because I haven't said what I should have said. He took a breath. But I need to say it now, before you make any kind of decision. Because I should have said it before this, and I didn't, and I'm not going to make that same mistake twice. A pause. The December air was cold and still. Someone was closing up his shop down the block. I think about you, he said. Most days. In the way that makes everything else a little less interesting by comparison. And I know that's not the most elegant thing a man has ever said. She didn't move. I don't want you to go to Carson City, he said. I don't want you to make a practical decision about your future that doesn't have me in it. And I know I have no claim on you, but I needed you to know that I see you, not just the useful version of you that runs a dry goods store. All of it. A pause. I just needed to say it out loud. Willa looked at him. She had prepared, she realized, for many versions of this conversation. She had prepared for the version where it never happened. She had prepared for the version where she made the practical choice and moved to Carson City and built something reliable with a man who had already decided. She had not quite prepared for this version. For the cold Thursday afternoon, and the stacked lumber and Joel Crane looking at her with all his usual steadiness and something underneath it that she recognized because she had been carrying the same thing herself for 2 months. She said, "Joel." He waited. "I left Utah with 1 wagon and $40 and no fixed idea of where I was going to end up." She looked at him. "I've been in Harlan 2 months, and in that time I have organized your uncle's store, learned the names of every supplier in the county, and managed not to make a single impractical decision." A pause. "I am very good at practical decisions." He nodded. "You are the only impractical thought I've had since I got here," she said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the specific expression of a man who has been told something he had barely let himself hope was true. "I'd like to come calling on you properly," he said, "if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, with the dry precision that was entirely hers, "I'd like that. But Joel, I've been waiting for you to show up for 2 months. Don't make me wait much longer." He almost smiled. Then he actually smiled. The one that arrived slowly and then stayed. "I won't," he said. He came to the store the next morning. Good shirt. Combed hair. The expression of a man who had made up his mind about something and was not going to waste another hour on the matter. Bernard was behind the counter. He looked at Joel and the shirt and the expression, and he turned around and called toward the back with the careful neutrality of a man who has been waiting for this particular morning for some time. "Willa, Joel Crane is here." Footsteps on the floorboards. Then she came through the door and stopped, and the look she gave him had none of the careful management she usually kept in place. "Just you came. I'd like your uncle's permission to call on Willa properly," Joel said to the middle distance between Bernard and the door. Bernard Foss discovered something extremely interesting on the shelf behind him. "You have it," he said to the shelf. Willa looked at Joel. Something in her had settled. The particular tension of someone who has been carrying a thing alone for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. "You know," she said, "most men who come calling bring flowers." He looked at his empty hands, looked back at her. "I'll bring them tomorrow." "And after that?" "Every day," he said, "for as long as you'll have them." She looked at him for one moment more. Then she smiled. The real one. The one that was not for the whole room. "Then you'd better not be late," she said. What followed was the most closely observed courtship in Harlan's recent memory. He brought wildflowers the next morning, pulled from the creek bank on his way in, and she put them in a jar on the counter without comment, which caused immediate and extensive speculation among the regulars. He came to Friday supper at the Fosses. Francis made the good roast. Bernard was warm in the way of a man who has been hoping for something and is relieved it has finally arrived. Willa sat across from Joel and they talked the way they always had, easily and without effort, except that now neither of them was pretending the ease was merely professional. On a Sunday in January, when the valley was white and the air was cold enough to ache, they walked the ridge road that ran along the north side of town and looked out over Harlan spread below, the mill and the church and the store, the whole small machinery of the place. "Why me?" he asked, not rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to know. "Because you never tried to be impressive," she said. She looked at the valley. "Every man who came into that store was showing me something. His prospects or his connections or his opinion of himself. You came in for sandpaper." She paused. "You treated me like a person who was good at her job, not like a problem to be solved." He was quiet. "Martin Danner is a capable man," she said. "He is. Joel." She turned to look at him directly. "I've made a lot of practical choices in my life. I'm good at them, but I did not come 300 miles to make another one." A pause. "I came because Harlan had room for a dry goods operation, and because my uncle needed help, and because—" She stopped, "because when I got here, there was a man who looked at me like I was worth looking at, and he didn't seem to know it, and I decided to wait long enough to find out if he'd figure it out." He looked at her, at this woman who had come from nowhere and quietly, without any performance at all, become the most interesting thing in his life. I almost didn't, he said. I know, she said. That's the part that mattered. The valley was white below them. The cold was absolute and clean, and something that had been patient for a long time sat down beside him on that ridge road and stopped keeping its own counsel. He asked her in February, on the step of the store, at the end of a Tuesday evening, because it was neither staged nor calculated, and therefore, he had decided. Correct, he had his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket. A thin gold band with a small garnet, the kind of ring made for a working life, not a showcase. He said, Willa, I've been slow about almost everything that has mattered in my life, and I'm trying not to be slow about this. She looked at him. I love you, he said. I think I have since about the 3rd week you were here, which I understand is not a fact that reflects particularly well on my judgment, but I know it now, and I'd like to marry you if you'll have a man who took longer than he should have to say what he should have said. Willa Foss looked at Joel Crane in the February cold. Joel, she said, that is genuinely the least graceful proposal I have ever heard. I know. I practiced it, and this was the better version. A pause. The street was empty. A lamp burned in the window of the store behind her. Yes, she said, simply. The way you say a word that has been waiting for the right place to land. He put the ring on her finger on the store step. She looked at it the way you look at something that fits correctly. Not surprised, just confirmed. They married in March before the spring mud made the roads difficult, which was practical in the way that Willa was always practical, even about the things that were not practical at all. The church was full. Harlan felt, as a community, that it had been personally involved in this outcome and had earned its attendance. Mac Duval, in the 4th pew, was observed to wipe his eye at a moment he later attributed to dust. Frances Foss cried openly and did not apologize for it. Bernard stood beside her and was very composed and didn't fool anyone. Willa came down the aisle in her good blue dress, the same one she'd worn to the pie social, because she was not a woman who bought things for singular occasions when the thing she already owned was perfectly sufficient. She walked toward Joel with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has been headed somewhere for a long time and has finally stopped having to navigate sideways to get there. Joel stood at the front of the church and watched her come and understood, with the sudden and complete clarity of a man standing still for the first time in a long while, how close it had been. How he had come into that store 3 times and bought his supplies and left. How Martin Danner had been 2 weeks from making his offer. How another month of his own oblivious contentment would have been the end of the story before he knew he was in it. He was not going to be that slow again about anything. They said their vows. They meant them. The years that followed were good ones, built from work and weather and the particular warmth of 2 people who came from difficulty and knew better than to take good things for granted. The mill grew. Willa kept the accounts because it became apparent within the first month that Joel had been underpricing his work with a consistency that she found both touching and financially alarming. And she corrected it with the brisk competence of someone who had grown up understanding that generosity was admirable and solvency was necessary, and the two were not mutually exclusive. He didn't argue. He had understood very early that on questions of numbers and practical sense, Willa was simply right, and there was no productive reason to pretend otherwise. Their daughter arrived in the 2nd year. They named her June. For the month the lumber was most in demand and the valley was at its best. And Joel had first really looked at Willa in the store and not looked away. A child with her father's steadiness and her mother's eyes and a laugh that made the whole house feel larger. Their son came in the 4th year. They named him Thomas after Joel's father, a boy with Willa's precision and her way of observing things before she commented on them, which Joel found both familiar and, occasionally, disconcerting. On a winter evening in their 7th year, Joel came home from the mill still cold from the afternoon, stamping snow from his boots at the gate, and found Willa at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a cup of tea going cold beside her, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. She was adding a column of figures. Her hair was coming loose on one side. There was an ink stain on her right hand. She was utterly absorbed. And this was the thing he had understood for years now and still found new. the most interesting person in any room she entered, and the room was always better for having her in it. She looked up. "You're letting the cold in." "I know." He came inside. He closed the door. He stood by the stove and looked at her. "Joel, I'm looking at you. I can see that. I used to not look," he said. I looked, but I didn't." He stopped. "I was thinking about that just now. Outside." She looked at him. The ledger was still open. "I used to look at you the way you look at something that's always been there," he said. "Like the mill, like the mountains. Present, accounted for. Not—" He stopped again. "I don't do that anymore." Willa looked at her husband for a moment. "No," she said, "you don't." He came to the table and sat down across from her, and she closed the ledger. And they talked, not about anything particular, about June's school lesson and Thomas's tooth in the Henderson order, the ordinary matter of a life they had built from specific and deliberate choices. The stove was warm. The snow was coming down outside. The children were asleep somewhere in the house. And somewhere in the middle of an ordinary sentence about ordinary things, Joel reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the hand with the ink stain, and she turned her hand over and held his. They didn't say anything. Some things, by the 7th year, don't need saying. Later, when June was 15 and beginning to have opinions about the young men of Harlan, she asked her mother, sideways in the middle of a completely different conversation. They were mending in the sitting room, and the question arrived between one stitch and the next. "How did you know Papa was the one before he knew it himself?" Willa considered the mending. "He never put anything on," she said finally. "Most people who come into a room are carrying something they want you to see, their standing, or their money, or their idea of themselves." She paused. "Your father came in for sandpaper." June looked at her. "That's not a reason." "It is," Willa said mildly. "It means he was there for what he actually needed, not for what he actually needed, not for what he wanted to look like. That's rarer than you'd think." She turned the hem she was working on, and he was kind, not in the loud way, in the way where you only notice it after, when you realize things got taken care of and nobody made a speech about it. "But you almost left," June said. "Because of Mr. Danner." Willa was quiet for a moment. "Almost," she said. She looked at her daughter, 15, and serious, and already so much smarter than she let anyone see. "That's the part I want you to understand," she said. "Not the ending, the almost." She set down the mending. "You can be patient. Patience is good. But patience without a limit isn't patience. It's just waiting. And waiting doesn't move anything forward." A pause. "At some point, you say the true thing. You give the person the chance to see it. And if they don't, then you know," June said. "Then you know." Willa nodded. "And you move forward. You don't perform. You don't shrink. You say the true thing to the right person, and the right person shows up." She picked the mending back up. "Your father was slow. He was the slowest man I have ever watched not notice something obvious." The corner of her mouth moved, but he showed up. June was quiet for a while after that. Outside, they could hear Joel in the yard, doing something with the fence that had needed doing for 2 weeks. Unhurried, steady, present. The way he always had been. That, in the end, is the thing worth holding. Not the romance of the confession, not the relief of the ring, not even the warmth of the 7th-year kitchen with the snow outside. It's the simpler thing underneath. Willa Foss did not wait passively. She built a life. She showed up every morning as exactly herself, without softening herself into something more convenient or sharpening herself into something more obvious. And when she understood that time had a shape and that shape was ending, she said the true thing on a cold December street and walked away without waiting to see if it landed. That took more than patience. That took a particular kind of courage that doesn't get celebrated because it doesn't look like courage from the outside. It just looks like a woman standing in a lumberyard having a conversation. And Joel. Joel is not a cautionary tale. He's something closer to familiar, a man so accustomed to the presence of something good that he forgot to understand it was not guaranteed, until a Tuesday morning when Mac Duval leaned against a fence post and said Martin Danner's name, and the clock that had been running quietly became suddenly, undeniably loud. Sometimes that's what it takes. Not the arrival of love. That was already there. But the understanding that love, like a good mill and a well-built fence and everything else worth having, requires someone to show up for it. They did. At the last reasonable moment, with the snow coming and the offer 2 weeks out, they chose each other. Deliberately. Impractical and correct. That's the part worth keeping.